2024 might soon be over, but don't fear, as 2025 promises to bring even more action to the Space Coast. SpaceX is finally resuming work for Starship in Florida with new expansions and launch pad work. Blue Origin is pushing ahead for New Glenn's debut, with more testing and future plans shaping up. Stoke Space is also making great progress gearing up for the first launch of their fully reusable Nova rocket, and as usual, we'll have a lot more to talk about in this Space Coast Flyover. If you've been following these Cape flyovers for a while, you know it's not just my face you get to look at. We'll have Adrian and Alex joining in as well to discuss all the intriguing things that the team spotted during the flyover. So without further ado, let's head over to SpaceX's Roberts Road facility, where activity with Starship hardware seems to be picking up once again. And that is because work continues on the Orbital Launch Mount. That's right, we've spotted parts for the Starship launch mount that will go to Launch Complex 39A, although most of the pieces spotted aren't part of the launch mount itself, but rather will aid in its construction. 4 large components appear to be designed to support the mount's corners, while several other sections seem intended to reinforce the middle portions of the structure. The actual launch mount components spotted include 5 large sections forming part of the mount's base layer. This is similar to the hardware seen for the second launch pad at Starbase, giving a clear idea of where these pieces will fit into the final structure. The new launch mount design has 3 layers. The bottom, which directly anchors to the launch platform and has the flame trench underneath. Then there's a middle layer with all the hold down clamps, and finally a top deck which contains water-cooled channels to keep it all from melting during launch and catch. The launch mount also has a square shape with a circular opening in the middle of it for the rocket to fit in. If you're a regular viewer of our Starbase Update series, you probably knew this already, but if you're not, then now you know. Of the 5 pieces we saw during this flyover, 4 of them are the corners of the bottom layer, while the other longer piece is one of the sides of the square. The identical design of the launch mount to Starbase's second pad raises questions about whether the entire launch pad setup at LC-39A will follow the same blueprint. This could include similar hardware and infrastructure, but we'll explore that in more detail later. If you remember back in the day, SpaceX was already building an OLM in Florida when they still used the old design of the launch mount. That one was built in Hangar M on the industrial side of the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and as of October, it was still sitting outside. With new components now appearing at Roberts Road, it seems likely that SpaceX will assemble this updated OLM there instead. We'll keep an eye out as more pieces arrive. The exact location at Roberts Road where the OLM will be built remains uncertain, but the newly constructed tent seems to be a strong candidate. During our last flyover, SpaceX was just beginning work on the tent, which has since been completed. Notably, it's built on rails, allowing it to be rolled back and forth, a handy feature if crane lifts are needed while keeping the structure protected from the elements between operations. Of course, this is complete speculation, but this setup would be, coincidentally ideal for assembling the OLM. Besides the tent and OLM pieces, we've got even bigger news from Roberts Road. We have finally got an expansion. After more than a year of talking about this proposal, SpaceX has begun clearing ground for the north expansion at Roberts Road. This development will proceed in phases, with phase 1 covering 43 acres. Future phases will extend across the entire northern plot, significantly increasing the facility's capacity. We detailed this phased expansion in our previous flyover. Since our last flyover, SpaceX has not only started clearing the area for phase 1, but they've also cleared vegetation to mark its boundaries. This can be seen more clearly in this satellite view provided by our friend Harry Stranger, who you should definitely follow on X if you like seeing space from space. What exactly will be built here is still unclear, but as we mentioned in the previous flyover episode, this area is as large as the entire Starbase production site, giving SpaceX plenty of space to build something quite substantial. That is to say, there's a strong possibility that this area will eventually become SpaceX's own production facility for Starship rockets in Florida. With the potential for Starship production facilities finally being built and a launch pad back in the works, 2025 could turn out to be an incredibly exciting year for Space Coast Starship fans, and if you happen to be one of them, consider subscribing, clicking the like button, doing all the YouTube things to feed the algorithm that we're beholden to. The best way to know if we're going to see a massive production site for Starship in the future is if we start spotting familiar hardware for a potential mega bay arriving at Roberts Road, along with a big crane being assembled in preparation for that. Apart from the North expansion, SpaceX has also been busy with other types of groundwork. While Max and Dee were flying over the area, they spotted an excavator working on the road that connects the west and east sides of the complex. The rest of the road has also been flattened, and it looks like it might be paved as well. Not a bad move, considering they'll want to make all of this much more permanent in the near future. SpaceX has also installed new Starlink community gateways, which are these 4 dome-shaped units next to the retention pond. SpaceX advertises them as being capable of delivering up to 10 gigabits per second of internet bandwidth. You might have seen some of the publicity of them being used to connect super remote settlements before. The company has essentially installed one or more of these at every facility they have, including on their drone ships. With 4 of these now at Roberts Road, it's sure to improve internet access for all the employees working there. Why would you pay to run a big fiber cable for employee internet if you can just do it yourself with at-cost pricing? During this flyover, we also spotted these strange rectangles on the ground, which seem like they might be filled in with concrete. It's a bit odd and difficult to tell what they're for at the moment, but we'll certainly be keeping an eye on them as things develop. We also noticed that the new addition to the Hangar X building is nearly complete, and during the flyover it looked like they were just putting some final touches on it. Speaking of final touches, it also seemed like they were removing one of the AC units at Hangar X2, which was there when we last flew over. This is probably just regular maintenance, but it's worth mentioning since it's right in view of most of the Roberts Road facility. Now it's time for the latest on Blue Origin and what's coming up with their New Glenn rocket, so here's Adrian.
Starting at Exploration Park, we can see the expansion at the Airbus OneWeb satellite factory is nearing structural completion. When comparing our flyover photos to this render, you can see that there are still some cosmetic addition yet to come, as well as the new parking area. Just across the road from OneWeb we have Blue Origin's manufacturing facilities. 2025 will be a very big year for Blue, with the first launch of New Glenn possibly slipping to early in the year, maybe even a few more flights after that, including a mission to the moon, as well as lots of new facilities being constructed. So let's dig in. Starting with the north side of the campus, we were lucky enough to capture a New Glenn second stage inside of the 2CAT building. Now, something interesting to note here is that to our knowledge, this is the first time that there has been a stage inside of the building since a testing failure damaged 2CAT back in August. While the large segments of the damaged door still lay in front of the building, it's a good sign to see Blue bringing another stage to be tested. The fact that the second stage was hooked up to the bridge crane and that a few employees were actively working near the connection of the tank and the stand leads us to think that this stage was only just lifted into the building before we flew over. The stage itself could end up flying next year. Unfortunately, the doors to 2CAT's big sibling, TCAT, were closed as we flew by, so we couldn't see if there was a first stage tank inside. However, we did spot what could be some molds or rejects of BE3U's vacuum nozzle extensions. Nearby were also 2 domes. Based on the appearance, these look to be for a second stage. Given both sets of these items are sitting on the ground, out in the open, it's safe to assume that these aren't flight articles. Another interesting tidbit is the segment of a ring-like structure being delivered on a trailer. Given the size and shape of this object, this could be another transport ring like we already see being used when New Glenn's first stage are moved between facilities. Or maybe it's a part of another launch ring that New Glenn rests on while atop its transporter erector at Launch Complex 36. With the object being wrapped, it's hard to be sure, but we thought this was an interesting spot. Just south of the main factory building is the large new parking garage, which appears to be in its final stage of construction. From this view above, it seems like most of the remaining work will be constructing roads to and from the garage. As Blue continues to ramp up production for New Glenn and other programs, having a large parking garage like this is something that serves a very important purpose, even if it seems rather boring compared to everything else going on. Speaking of other programs within Blue Origin, the Lunar Production Facility, or Lunar Plant 1, continues to grow. This large building will be where Blue will, as the name implies, produce its lunar landers. And as you can tell from the size of the building structure, these landers aren't small. This directly connects to one of Blue's big goals of 2025, which is launching the Blue Moon Pathfinder mission on New Glenn. While the Pathfinder itself probably won't be assembled in this building, given its current state. Next door to Lunar Plant 1, we can see the new storage facility being rebuilt after the initial structure was knocked down by Hurricane Milton in mid-October. Around these buildings we can see dirt being prepared ahead of more permanent roads being laid to support increased traffic in the area. Just south of the light industrial building and next to a tent we can see new building foundations being worked on. These foundations may be for a facility we have seen on plans for a few years now, and this could finally be part of that construction. If the planning documents we have seen in the past are still up to date, this should be for the Chemical Processing Facility, or CPF. I guess only time will tell if this does follow those plans. Going south just a little further to the newest section of Blue's campus, we can see that the most recent clearing has been seemingly turned into a temporary parking lot as well as a storage area. Notably, while our team was flying, there were at least 5 trucks delivering framework for yet another building. Maybe for the CPF that we saw foundations for, or maybe something entirely different. With that, let's head over to Launch Complex 36, where Blue are working towards New Glenn's first flight with the actual rocket currently on the pad. As I just said, yes, this is the actual flight article of New Glenn on the launch pad at LC-36, standing 98 meters tall, towers over the Space Coast, and has actually been rather busy lately. But before we get to that, let's quickly catch up on what happened since our last flyover. New Glenn's first stage at GS1 rolled from the factory to the launch complex on October 30. After arriving at the hangar, Blue integrated the GS1 with its second stage, GS2, and the payload fairing. The vehicle then would have been lifted onto the transporter erector. On November 20, the TE rolled New Glenn out to the pad and went vertical the next day. As of this recording, Blue seems to have done at least one propellant load of New Glenn's second stage, as we saw vapor coming from that area of the TE on the night of December 4th, along with the liquid hydrogen flare stack burning. On the next night, December 5th, we saw a lot of flare stack activity from the methane tank farm, but no obvious signs of propellant loading. All of this is in lead up to the static fire of New Glenn's first stage on the launch pad, the final hardware milestone before launch. This will be a huge moment, as it will be the first time we will see all 7 of New Glenn's BE-4s light up, but also because the static fire is likely part of the criteria for a final go for launch. Of course, one another crucial part of hardware for a New Glenn launch is Jacqueline, Blue's ocean landing platform. And for that and more, I'll hand it back to Alex to talk all about what's going on at Port Canaveral.
Well, Adrian, at Port Canaveral we have even more activity from Blue Origin. You might remember from our last flyover, Blue's Jacqueline barge was at the time in Jacksonville, likely getting some work done. We mentioned back then that the barge was supposed to go out again for testing because Blue had filed for a communications permit to test New Glenn's communication equipment out at sea. Well, since our last flyover, Jacqueline is finally back in port and has indeed gone out a few times to perform this testing. During the flyover, Max and Dee spotted once again the New Glenn aft section simulator, and it appears that Blue Origin has built some sort of robot to service the booster after landing. In these shots we can deduce what appears to be an arm reaching out to the booster aft simulator, likely to simulate this device reaching out to an actual landed booster and saving it. This is a bit different from how SpaceX does this, where instead the robot they have, called Octograbber, just simply keeps the booster in place during the trip home by grabbing onto his base and lowering the center of mass. Speaking of SpaceX droneship operations, this is probably a good time to talk about something that a lot of you probably have noticed lately during Falcon 9 landings. It seems like SpaceX has installed a water deluge system of sorts on Just Read the Instructions, and we've seen the system running for at least the last couple of months. I personally went through my spreadsheet and noticed that there was a month gap in between missions that this droneship supported. It supported the Galileo launch on September 17th and then a Starlink launch on October 18th. And then if we compare the landing footage of both missions, there was no water on the Galileo landing, but there was on the next mission supported by this droneship, which was that Starlink launch in October. It turns out we probably captured them working on this system back on our September flyover, and we just thought, oh, might be some maintenance work on that droneship, when in fact they were installing this new system. It's very likely that this is their way of reducing the wear and tear on the deck of the drone ships, which could save them the hassle of having to send them to dry dock for a few weeks every handful of months. We'll be keeping an eye on a shortfall of gravitas, because if this turns out to be useful, then SpaceX may retrofit that drone ship with the same system. And from SpaceX recovery operations, let's go to the launch operations with Starship. And no, I'm not getting this wrong. I know I'm not on a Starbase update, but as you've seen earlier in the video, SpaceX is resuming Starship work at Florida. Since our last flyover, we've seen a lot of activity at Launch Complex 39A with multiple cranes and lifts around the tower. One thing that we've also seen is the dismantling of the large liquid oxygen tank that SpaceX had built for Starship back in 2022. They even brought 2 big cranes to help on that dismantling. Back when the LOX tank was built, SpaceX also planned to install a few horizontal tanks nearby with more liquid oxygen and liquid nitrogen as well. All of this to be part of the liquid oxygen side of the new Starship tank farm. However, all of these horizontal tanks and all the hardware for them was removed shortly after and were actually sent to Texas, where they either went to the Massey outpost or were installed at the Starbase launch site. Now with the big LOX tank also going away, it seems like SpaceX may have a newer and different design for a Starship tank farm at LC-39A. Perhaps another sign of a change in the tank farm design might be on the transfer lines for the methane tank farm at this pad. In case you don't remember, SpaceX refurbished the all-hydrogen sphere at LC-39A, which was used during Apollo and Shuttle, and repurposed it to hold liquid methane for Starship. Along with that, the company also installed extra horizontal tanks with more methane and also with liquid nitrogen, and installed a bunch of subcoolers as well, just like we've seen at Starbase. In order to transfer all of those fluids from that methane tank farm to the launch mount and launch tower, teams built a series of transfer lines from that tank farm all the way out to the back of the launch tower. It is part of these transfer lines that have now been removed from the launch site, and the scraps of that are in fact now stacked to one side. During this flyover, we also spotted a few excavators on site, which might indicate some groundwork is about to happen. Now, it wouldn't be surprising if what SpaceX ends up doing is a similar thing to what's going on at Starbase, where all the storage tanks for the tank farm are long horizontal tanks and all of the transfer lines are going underground. But another use for those excavators could be to build a flame trench for Starship, and I bet a bunch of you were just yelling at the screen, "It's for the flame trench!" With the launch mount parts that we've seen at Roberts Road being very much the same as the parts for the launch mount for Pad B at Starbase, it stands to reason to think that perhaps everything else might change accordingly. That is to say, we might see SpaceX build a flame trench at 39A, just like they're doing at Starbase for Pad B. Right now there are no signs of such work, but we'll keep an eye on subsequent flyovers and of course through our Space Coast Live 24/7 stream. Now, while all of this Starship work is going on, SpaceX is still keeping 39A busy with Falcon. In fact, this flyover was performed just a few hours after the SXM-9 launch and is soon gonna have another launch from there later this week. The flyover happened so soon after launch that on the LOX tank farm for Falcon, the subcooler was still frosty and venting after having supported that launch. By the way, in that picture there looks to be an excavator nearby, coincidentally at an area where SpaceX eventually wants to build an air separation unit for Starship. Maybe it's not related, but you never know. And at SpaceX's other launch pad in Florida, Space Launch Complex 40, launches continue to happen at an unprecedented pace, making it the world's busiest launch pad. And yet, in all that busyness, SpaceX has decided that it was a great place to put an extended Falcon fairing to one side of the complex. We're not sure why they did this, but it's certainly cool that we can now see how an extended Falcon fairing looks like, and I cannot wait to see it fly. whenever that is. Of course, at the Space Coast, there are a bunch more launch sites where activity is starting to pick up, such as Stoke Space's Launch Complex 14. The company is quickly working towards the first launch of their fully reusable Nova rocket in 2025, and recently broke ground at the launch complex so that everything is ready for a launch soon. As we reported a few flyovers ago, Stoke recently got a finding of no significant impact or FONSI for its launch pad, which cleared the way for this work to start, so it was not a surprise. It'll be exciting to see this historic launch site, which hosted the orbital flights of the Mercury program, get a second life hosting a modern 21st century fully reusable rocket. Meanwhile, Relativity is also on its own continuing work at their launch site, Launch Complex 16. This pad is expected to support launches of their upcoming Terran R rocket, which is planned to be partially reusable. From this distance on our flyover, it's quite hard to see exactly all of the groundwork that's going on, but it looks like foundations for the new hangar to accommodate Terran R's larger size may be underway. As for the launch pad itself, it seems that the focus is on the flame trench foundations. At the same time, ULA also continues with the expansion of its Spacecraft Processing and Operations Center, and yes, that's SPOC, which is being upgraded to be a second vertical integration facility for Vulcan. With this second facility, ULA aims to be able to ramp up Vulcan's launch cadence in order to support launches of Amazon's Kuiper constellation. And of course, another big piece of launch hardware being worked on at the Space Coast has been the Mobile Launcher 2 for NASA's SLS program. The Exploration Ground Systems team recently brought a new crane to aid on the construction of the launch tower that will go on this platform. The crane in particular is a DMAG CC8800, and if that sounds familiar to you, it's because that's the same crane model as the one that was used to build the second Starship launch tower at Starbase. Some even rumor it might even be the same one that was recently dismantled at the South Texas site. The thought of a crane that just put together a Starship launch tower now also putting together a launch tower for SLS is definitely chuckle-inducing.
And that wraps up this month's Cape Flyover. It's going to be super exciting to see the second reusable heavy lift rocket coming online shortly. New Glenn, it's just such a good looking rocket, and I'll be honest, I'm getting Starship Flight 1 levels of hype. I've been Ryan Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.